Dear colleagues, hello everybody. I'm Vladimir Pechatnov, a professor of history at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And I have been fortunate enough to have a wide experience of working in both Russian and American and British archives for that period of the World War II and the early Cold War. So I'm able, I think, to compare how things are organized in our country and compared to UK and US. Well, my assignment today is give you a short tour of archival holdings in Russia pertaining to the World War II and early Cold War. It's a big task, but let me very briefly show you around and make it this short tour. Let's start with the Archive of Foreign Policy of Russian Federation, or AVP in Russian, which is the main depository of foreign policy related records in Russia. It's similar somewhat to Record Group 59 at the College Park, the National Archives in the States, and also somewhat to the Foreign Office collection at the British Archives. But the difference is that it has a different system of organization. Instead of decimal files in the American case and numbered folders in the British case, we have 5-layer system in Russian archives. You start with the name of the font, which is a big, huge collection of documents usually. Then you go by the inventories, or OPC. Each font would have a list of OPC, which would give you an idea of how many folders are there. And then you go in Foreign Ministry Archive, there is a next stage called Papka, which is a cluster of folders, dozens of them sometimes. And then you go down to individual folders, usually divided by subjects. And then when you are on that level, you have this, the pages for each document. So the normal typical citation would be font, OPC, Dela, font, OPC, Papka, Dela, and individual pages for that particular folder. It looks complicated, but once you get used to the system, it's fairly easy to operate. By the way, it's been in action in Russia even before the Soviet times. In pre-revolutionary Russia, the system was somewhat similar. So how do you get there? How do you get to the reading room of AVP? It's fairly standard procedure. You write a nice letter to the director of the archive, Mrs. Zaleva, explaining the purpose of your research and your affiliation, and then giving your subject as narrow formulated as possible to make it easier to locate stuff for you. And they're supposed to answer you in about a month's time normally. And of course, in most cases, you're just given the permission to come and work there. The problem at AVP is that you don't have an update and detailed finding files, finding aids or inventories to the collections. So you have to rely on archivists, which are special people, as we all know. So you have to be very considerate, patient, persistent, and polite, of course, with those people. They are, especially with so-called fondохранители. These are the curators of specific collections, and they're supposed to know them very, very well. So that's how you get there. What are the main collections at AVP related to our period? It's first of all, of course, it's Molotov Fund. Molotov was a foreign ministry, I would remind you, from 41 to 49, and he came back a little bit later, but that was after Stalin's death. So he was in charge in this sense, and the most essential documents, of course, went all the way up to his secretariat. So Molotov Fund number 6 is the key element of that collection. It's much in demand. Its physical condition of the originals is very poor. So normally the archivist would not give the originals to the reading room. But fortunately, many of those documents have been either published in various collections or digitized in recent years. So to save time and effort, I would advise you to start with the published stuff and digitized stuff so that you get prepared for the work to save valuable time at the archive itself. All except for late 80s, all the other documentary publications have references to specific archival references. So it's easy for you then to look for more specifically, to narrow your search and to look for what you're looking for more specifically and be on firmer ground. So that would really help. The item is the documents on Soviet foreign policy. The latest volume is 25. As you can see, it covers 43. That's the latest. Now they're still working on the 44, lagging behind, of course, all the possible limits. So many telegrams from IVP would be published here related to our subject. So it's similar to FRUS, but the difference is that FRUS is more comprehensive because in this case you have only foreign ministry documents, nothing of interagency origins, nothing from National Security Council and so forth. And there are some documents here, both recent and not very recent. I would recommend this edition, which is fairly recent and unfortunately, not widely used. It's a volume in the series of World Great Patriotic War, published, it's huge collective work in 12 volumes. So volume 8 is devoted to the Russian foreign policy during the war. It's very solid research, mostly done by civilian historians, not military people. People like myself, my colleagues from our institute, from diplomatic academy. So I would recommend this volume, which has a lot of archival material with all the references and so forth. And finally, you have our recent book with David Reynolds, the English edition of this Переписка. The Russian edition of Переписка is more extensive. There are more documents here. It has 2 volumes, but Yale University Press wouldn't do 2 volumes, so they compressed it into one volume. So you start with this published stuff and go from there. On the digitized documents in AP, in Russian. The main collection here is AGK, which stands for Anti-Hitlerovskaya Koalitsiya, the big 3 during the war, and has all the many documents related to the Soviet American, Soviet British, and Soviet French relations during the war. It has 3 main segments here. Molotov's Fund, number 6, which I described already. And if we take, for instance, Soviet American relations, you will have there both Molotov funds, sources to begin with. You see, you have the OPC here, the inventories, 211 individual folders. You can go to the inventories, click on any of those folders and see the originals in facsimile versions. Well, there are 2 main collections in addition to the Molotov's fund. You have 2 other holdings. That is number 182, Embassy, Soviet Embassy in Washington, and also Referentura 129, Referentura по США, which is basically American desk at Foreign Ministry. And the embassy stuff is understandable, right? I think Professor Radchenko talked about Referentura holdings for the later period. So let me say a few words about the embassy records, especially since I worked in the embassy much later, of course, in late 80s and early 50s. So I know how these documents are produced. So here you have almost everything which is produced by the embassy. That is official correspondence with American authorities. You have memocons, you have reference sheets of all the kinds, statistics, reports, analytical reports. Especially I would recommend looking for political letters. They are usually devoted to important subjects. And finally, an annual report for the year, which is Soviet, Russian, and British tradition. I don't think the State Department has this practice of an giving annual report for the year. But here you would have it in the font 1992, and it's very easy to use. As you can see, you go to the inventory list and then to the individual folder. You see the 39 folders in this office, 50 here, 44. All in all, it's a huge collection because you have almost 4,000 folders as a whole in it, which has about 370,000 pages of documents. So it's a very big collection, both for cultural, economic, and political relations. It covers almost everything. So this is an important collection. Declassification. Few words on this. Usually, most of the stuff for that period has been declassified, except for the font number 59, that is cipher telegrams. Everybody wants to see that, but it remains closed, not so much because it has many secrets in it, but because it's of the way it's organized. It's a mixture of substantial stuff, cables and of political with some content. And there is also a huge amount of technical information, routine, like, well, for instance, wife of embassy driver, Miss Ivanova, is arriving next week, and so forth. So they still haven't found how to separate those two things. But fortunately, many of those cables have been declassified and published in various forms, including those publications. Sometimes declassification is done for specific project or purpose. For instance, when we worked on our PDP, the Big Three correspondence during the war, we had a blessing from the foreign minister, which helps. So he gave the command and archive declassified for us, exclusively for this project, about 100 telegrams, which were an important contribution. They were about to declassify them anyway, but they speeded it up for us, and that was very, very helpful. That's about the main holdings there for that period. There are no, from what I know, there are no big plans for further digitization at the moment. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is also smaller digitized collections on the foreign ministry site, and you have the references in my PowerPoint. It's easy to find. The most recent acquisition is a small collection of documents pertaining to the 75th anniversary of the victory in Great Patriotic War. So this anniversaries sometimes help to get things out. So you'll see some new stuff on Yalta, Potsdam, liberation of Central Europe, and so forth. So there are also smaller digitized collection on the Foreign Ministry archive. But they don't have money, they say, for massive new projects of digitization in the near future, but they'll be working on it anyway. What's the current situation at the archive? I just preparing for this session, I talked to the director, Zaleva, and she heard that the archive is being closed until October 15, as of now. But even they operate on reduced personnel, about 50%, and the future is uncertain. What happens after mid-October is uncertain, but even when they do open, they would be operating on a restricted basis, because of the rules these days. You have to have empty places in between. So, and the reading room is not that big at ABAP. And besides, as she said, they have a heavy backload of previous requests dating from the spring. But I would still recommend for those of you who are planning to come in the near future to send your request, if only to be put on the waiting list so that you don't have to wait for too long. That's the current situation at ABAP. Let me now talk about other collections and for that period. And the main source here, at least for me, was called Documents on the Soviet Epoch, which comes from this particular collection. Stalin's personal fund, as you can see, Fund 558 comes from Rogaspi. Okay, so you have this portal gateway. You look for Stalin. There are two actually funds. One is Stalin Fund in this rubric, and there is a new edition on the Great Patriotic War, which has some interesting documents on the State Committee on Defense, which was the supreme governing body, on the Government Council of People's Commissar, which is essentially the government for the war period. But mostly it's about the war economy and economic mobilization. So let's get to the Stalin's Fund, which is a very rich collection of about 8,000 folders. For us, it's easy to operate. You just go down by the level and you have OPC here. And for us, for our purposes, the most important thing, part of it is OPC 11, which has, as you can see, some 175 folders, which is basically whatever there is available there for Stalin, documents sent to him, signed by him, and that's where we got most of our stuff on Stalin's Peripisko, Stalin's correspondence on with Churchill and Roosevelt. All the originals are there. So let me show you how these documents look, because that's what got me involved into this project. To give you an idea about how these famous messages were written. So the drafts were prepared by Molotov, in most cases personally by him. And then Stalin would check on them and edit them. Sometimes very heavily, sometimes lightly, sometimes changing the substance almost diametrically. So in this case, you see how it worked. Molotov signs the draft and sent to Comrade Stalin, товарищу Сталину, на утверждение, for the approval. And Stalin approves that with his signature. And in commas, he said, corrections are in the text. And here are his correction in blue pencils. Sometimes these corrections, as I said, very substantial. Here he writes the whole message. And especially here, he changes the meaning, the gist of Molotov's message almost entirely, making a U-turn, which is somewhat rare, but happens. And this is my favorite. You see how they did it sometimes. It looks like children ploy almost. It's both Molotov here by black pencil and Stalin by red pencil all over the place, and Stalin's signature. So when I saw this for the first time, and similar stuff in Roosevelt Library with Roosevelt's corrections, I immediately understood that there is a story to tell and something to investigate. So that's about the documents in Stalin's phone. Now we go to the most recent project which I was involved with, dealing with the period. It was organized by the Rosarchiv, but it's multiple archival projects. We were fortunate to get some cooperation both from the British and American archives, got some materials from them. So it's a fairly interesting and fresh collection, which has our introductory article written by myself and Chief of the Ross Archive, Artizov, but there is also the substantial catalog. It takes long to upload, so you'll see it for yourself. But here is all the items of the exposition. Especially interesting are paintings. Paintings done about the same time by rather famous Russian painters of the day. They had never been exhibited anywhere. So they were seen with depicting scenes from Tehran and from Yalta, and even signing of the Anglo-Soviet Treaty in '42. Very, very well done. So you would enjoy, I think, would enjoy seeing it. What about the classification in other places aside from Epoch? You can see this is the database of recently declassified documents from Federal Archives on this site, on the site of the Ross Archive, which is a compendium of everything which is being declassified. That's very convenient. Of course, it's very mixed collection, and you have to really dig out the stuff that you're interested in. But that's one way of checking whether there's been any recent declassification. There is also the digitized OPC, the inventory lists of many archives, not AVP, unfortunately, but GARF, Archive of Economics, military archives, and even the Archive of Literature. So you are welcome to use this collections as well. And there is also the guides and finding files to some archives also available here. Unfortunately, not for AVP, but you can use other guides. So a lot of stuff on the Ross Archive site that you may want to use. Now, a few words about other collections in other places. One thing which I would like to recommend is the new stuff at the State Archive of Russian State Archive of Economy. Recently, Special Fund number 413 was declassified and made available to researchers. It's a huge collection of records of Soviet Purchasing Commission in Washington, which was a huge enterprise, several hundred of Soviet personnel working. It's essentially a supply mission, which has, it's a very rich collection. I scratched the surface and whetted my appetite, but didn't have time to go deep into this. But at Koligom, Irina Bystrova, professor of history, from Institute of Russian History, recently published a book based on that collection. It's called Lend-Lease for SSSR, Economika, Technika, and Люди. Very interestingly, she goes into describing everyday life of that small Soviet colony in Washington. Very interesting work and very interesting collection. What remains closed on this period in overall picture? Well, it's about they say it's 5% of Stalin's fund, but I guess it's a very interesting 5%. So we are still waiting for that stuff to be declassified. And there is very little available on military planning during the war, especially, which of course was very strategically relevant and had some political significance as well. Things like general staff records, not available to regular scholars. Sometimes military historians use it sporadically, but it's something that is still in the waiting. And also, there is very little available on military diplomacy during the war. I have in mind the military attaché and their reports, and the personnel, Soviet personnel at Allied Control Commissions, which operated in the liberated countries, as you know, was an Allied body with very, very heavy military representation from the Soviet, especially from the Soviet side. So those records are still unavailable. They're coming out in bits and pieces, but that would be, in my view, a real significant addition to the sources on that period. Finally, let me say a few words about another project which you might be interested in. Last year, we planned with American and European colleagues to have a conference on Soviet foreign policy during the war, World War II, summarizing the research experiences, new sources, looking for new opportunities for research. That conference was planned in Italy for spring, but you know what happened. So it was rescheduled for December with very bleak prospects, I think, very problematic. But at least I hope there will be a Zoom conference, papers submitted, and the publication of those papers in the end. That would be one way to have a look at what's the current state of scholarship, both in Russia and in other countries as well. But overall, as you can see, there is a lot of room for further research and interpretations, even though it's fairly well researched already by now. But historians' work is never done. So the search for new documents and new interpretations would continue. And I hope that you would contribute to this process and wish you every success in your professional careers. Thank you for your attention.